Good evening and welcome to New York City Atheists live on tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I am your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. We are packed this evening, and for a very good reason. Our guest this evening is Professor Peter J. BRANCAZIO, who makes statements such as, Christianity is not the religion of Jesus, it's the religion about him. He contends that Jesus was a human being who did something in Jerusalem that got him crucified, and then he was mythologized. Sorry about that. Mythologized. It sounds like a process you make peanut butter with. The really interesting question is why his followers developed a religion about him. But before we get into that discussion, with a little background, Dr. BRANCAZIO was chosen by Newsday as one of 6 great teachers in New York in 1990. He taught for 35 years in the physics department of Brooklyn College. He created, taught for 7 years a now famous course called Science and Religion, partly inspired by a grant from the Templeton Foundation. And he's going to talk about that experience. And one of the great lines which I absolutely intend to steal is in describing that experience. He says, "I feel like a lion being thrown to the Christians." I am so going to use that. I'm so stealing that. So this started him on the way with on an intense study of the Bible, and he has done a rigorous cycle of studying all the books of the Bible, both the New Testament and the Old Testament, 4 times. I'm sure most of us have barely been able to scrape through it once. I guess that's why he's a teacher and I'm not. So, according to Dr. BRANCAZIO, the Bible is so central to our culture that you really have to know what's in it, even if you don't believe it. And he is the author of the book, The Bible from Cover to Cover, which I intend to get a copy of. So without further ado, and without having him have to sit through my murdering his name one more time, please welcome Dr. Peter BRANCAZIO.
In any event, the question is, how did all the races evolve from a single couple? It's physically, biologically impossible. Okay? But yet people believe this. The Catholic Church believes that there was a real Adam and Eve from which we all are inherited, and we inherit from them original sin. Now, that's an official dogma of the Catholic Church. They believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Okay? Next comes the story of Noah's Ark, and it's very confusing to read until you realize that it's actually 2 separate versions of the story that have been very cleverly interwoven in the text. And any good scholar can pull the 2 stories apart and see the 2 separate stories, one from one tradition, one from another tradition, and when they decided which one are we going to put in here, they had no reason to choose one over the other, so they just merged the stories together. So you'll find, for example, it rains for 40 days, the next thing you know it's raining for 100 days. And the story goes back and forth, but it's very easy to pull these 2 apart and see that there were 2 separate versions of the Ark story. And of course, there are creationists who believe that this really happened. They will tell you that the Grand Canyon was made in a week from water and mud that piled up and then suddenly somehow managed to solidify into this 2-mile deep layers and layers of rock. And to my question is, where did the water go? The water was supposed to cover up to the top of Mount Ararat. Now that would mean that the entire earth was covered over by water. Where did it all go? It's got to go someplace. Somebody just pulled the drain plug and it went down. So this requires divine intervention. The water has to just be evaporated into the sky. And the story gets crazier and crazier. Fascinating thing is that when people began to translate cuneiform, they found these Babylonian clay tablets by the thousands and thousands and thousands. Somebody finally managed to translate cuneiform, and at some point they pull up a tablet and they start reading the story of Gilgamesh, an ancient story, and in this story is the story of the flood. It predated the Bible by about 1,000 years. So the Bible story of the flood was actually taken from the Babylonians and edited into a different form. Also the question of how did the penguins get to Antarctica? I mean, if everybody landed on Mount Ararat, And how come the kangaroos only live in Australia? So obviously there had to be evolution. They didn't just go bouncing across the continents. The story of Abraham is a wonderful story. Abraham and God have these conversations back and forth. The question is, who is there taking this down? Who recorded the conversations between Abraham and God? Right? So these are not literal conversations. These are literary creations. Right? They're stories that were written by someone, not because he thought they were true, but because he thought they were good stories. Right? So there's this wonderful story where Abraham bargains with God. He says if there are 80 people if there are 80 people, I'm going to get this story backwards, I forgot. If there are 80 people in Sodom, I won't destroy it. He's okay. He says, well, how about if there are 40? And God says, well, I wouldn't destroy it if there were 40. Well, how about if there are 20? And so he bargains God down to about 10 people or something. It turns out everybody in Sodom is bad, so he kills all of them. But again, it's a question of who recorded these conversations. How do we accept this as a literal truth? Okay. The next book, Exodus, is a wonderful book. This is the central story of Judaism. It's very, very inspiring, of people in bondage, slavery, who escape through the miraculous divine intervention of God. And it raises a lot of questions. Like, if he did it then, why didn't he do it in 1944, 1945? Why did he intervene in that only one time? The rest of Jewish history has been one disaster after another. But this is their high point. God intervened. And of course, it's very important. If you have ever sat in on a Seder, a Passover Seder, you know what a wonderful experience this is to recount this story, to pass it along from generation to generation. Fascinating thing about this is there is no historical evidence whatsoever of anything remotely resembling an exodus of Jews or Israelites out of Egypt. There's simply no records, there's no archaeological evidence, nothing at all. And don't think people haven't been trying. It's been one of the sad points, from their point of view, of biblical archaeology, that they have never found a scrap of evidence that the Exodus actually took place. There is evidence that small groups of people may have escaped out here and there, but that's about it. There is no evidence of people wandering for 40 years in this desert. Where's all the water? Where are all the bodies? Where did the waste products go? Where were the porta sands? It's a great story, but the idea, and one of the things I like about it is Cecil B. DeMille's version, which they show every year. It is the worst movie ever made, and it is such fun to watch. What's fascinating about this, many things, but in the beginning they read this text, and it sounds like it's right out of the Bible, except it isn't. Not a single word of that text is out of the Bible. He just made it up, and it sounds very biblical. But I just like the idea of Moses and Aaron, these two dusty old Hebrews, asking for an audience with the Pharaoh. This is Ramses the Great, Ramses II, and who his people revered as a god, and asking for an audience. And they go in there and they say, let my people go. And they're now having a one-on-one conversation with the Pharaoh. In reality, they would have been strung up by their thumbs and nothing flat. Imagine some Mexican illegal aliens asking for an audience with President Bush. That's the equivalent story. But of course, it's a story, and it's a great story, and people enjoy reading it. The next book is a real stopper. People say, I'm going to read the Bible from cover to cover. They read Genesis, which is great stories. Exodus has got great stories. Then you come to Leviticus. And the first chapter tells you how to sacrifice a bird to the Lord. What parts you're supposed to cut out this and rip out that and throw the liver out. And literally, you have to read this. The liver goes here and the wings go there, and then you burn it on the altar to produce a pleasing odor for the Lord. So imagine the image that you get of somebody up in heaven going, oh, there's another sacrifice. So there's a whole pages and pages and pages describing in very repetitive detail how to sacrifice a bird, how to sacrifice a sheep, how to sacrifice a goat, all of these things. The interesting thing is that the leftover meat from the sacrifice goes to the priests. So it was their source of food, you know, and that was part of the deal. After that, Leviticus has all these rules about cleanliness, about what to do. There's a long passage on skin diseases and how they should be treated. And then there are the dietary laws about what animals you can eat and what animals you can't eat. Most people don't get through it. And that generally ends their reading of the Bible from cover to cover. The book of Numbers is 40 years in the wilderness, and it describes this angry confrontation. God is angry at Moses. Moses is angry at the Israelites. The Israelites are angry at God. Everybody's angry with everybody else, and they're smiting and killing, and everybody dies, except and including Moses at the end. It's a terrible book. And then the last book is Deuteronomy, which is the second law. And what you discover is that there's one set of laws in Exodus and a different set of laws in Deuteronomy. And scholars now understand that the 5 books of Moses were actually compiled by 4 different sources. This is called the documentary hypothesis. There are 4 different sources of this book. 2 of them from the northern kingdom and 2 of them from the southern kingdom. There were two religious traditions that went on. And the Bible contains both of these traditions. And so they very carefully merged these slightly different texts together. One of the things that you don't notice when you read it in English is that there are 2 gods. The Israelites worshipped 2 gods. There's Elohim and there's Yahweh. Now, Elohim is always translated as God, and Yahweh is always translated as the Lord. So you read the Lord, you read God, you think they're talking about the same person. But there's a big difference, because there are whole texts that are only about Elohim, and there are whole texts that are only call God by the name Yahweh. And the difference is that Elohim was the Canaanite high god. In other words, he was the creator god. He was the highest of the gods. Yahweh was a local tribal god. In other words, each of the tribes, all the different Canaanite tribes and the Moabites and all those people, each had their own tribal god. Yahweh was the tribal god of the Jewish people. So he was a local god. Now, the genius of Judaism is to merge the 2. And so when we say the Lord, well, I don't say it, when they say the Lord is our God, they're saying Yahweh is Elohim. So what they're doing is merging the 2 and saying, no, we don't have a local God and a high God. Yahweh is the high God. And so he is higher than all the other gods. And you find throughout the early books of the Bible these references to Yahweh is the greatest of all the gods. And so you see that the Jews were not monotheists. Monotheism is something that did not develop until around 500 BC. And during that long period of time, there was a big conflict between 2 groups, which scholars refer to as the pagan Yahwists, who worshipped many gods, including Yahweh, and the Yahweh alone crew, which said, we only worship Yahweh. And so they fought, and the Yahweh alone crew eventually won. But it was a constant battle, and the authors of these books are furious with the people of Israel. They call them all sorts of names. They call down all sorts of ruination on them. We're going to destroy you. You're going to be eating your children. All sorts of terrible things are going to happen if you continue to worship other gods. Now, they were worshiping the Canaanite gods. One of the known facts of archaeology is that almost every Israelite woman had in her home a statue of Asherah, who was the female fertility goddess of the Canaanites. And so they worship, and why not? You know? So, I mean, I always thought, when you compare monotheism and polytheism, I think polytheism makes a lot more sense than monotheism. It makes much more sense to think about a race of gods than to have just one God who's responsible for everything. But this is where monotheism comes from. It comes out of this battle between these 2 forces in which the monotheists eventually won out. Okay? But the Jews are still stuck with one God who is responsible for everything, and so are the Protestants, more or less. But the Catholics wisely invented saints and the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and so you have basically Catholicism is sort of polytheism in disguise. You really have many different things. You can go, you don't want to talk directly to God, so you talk to St. Anthony. and you can ask him to intercede. And I love this. Can you just picture this, you know? You pray to St. Anthony to intercede. Now, what goes on up there? St. Anthony, you know, knocks on the door and says, there's this guy down here, you know, he's having trouble with his wife. But it works. It works, you know? Out in Queens, where I live, people are trying to get rid of their houses, and people can't sell their houses. And so, and I'm not making this up. They are told, the word passed around, you take a statue of St. Joseph, and you plant it upside down in your backyard, and your house will be sold. Now, when I make this up, this is an old, and I mentioned this, oh yeah, my neighbor's doing that. So it's wonderful stuff, you know. But they have the advantage of taking the polytheistic religions that were around them and just adopting it, you know, just absorbing all of these deities and turning them into Catholic saints. And it certainly makes the religion much more colorful and much more accessible. Okay, now, the Mosaic Law, which comes out of the first 5 books. Religious Jews will tell you that they follow 613 mitzvahs, 613 laws. Well, the next time someone says that to you, ask them if they've ever seen a list of the 613 mitzvahs. They never have. And when you actually read this, now I have a book that has all 613 mitzvahs, and it's taken out, and included in these 613 mitzvahs are the proper way to kill a bird, the proper way to sacrifice a calf, on and on and on and on, just everything that's in there. And some rabbi in the last century went through this list and said, well, today we can only do 270 of them. So although they brag about 613 mitzvahs, only about 250 or so are actually things that you can really do in practice. People will tell, and many of our political leaders, especially down south, will tell you that our legal system is based on the Bible. That is absolute nonsense. It's a good thing that our legal system is not based on the Bible. Our legal system is based on Roman law and Greek law, which was passed through the British and became American law. It has nothing to do with biblical law. And as I say, it's a good thing because biblical law supports, among other things, capital punishment by stoning for all sorts of crimes. Right? Even if you have a rebellious teenager, it's in the book of Deuteronomy, if you have a rebellious teenager and they won't listen to you, you take them down to the gate and you stone them. There it is. Slavery is supported. There is not a single word in the New Testament, the Old Testament, against slavery. Right? And I always felt that there should be a commandment someplace that says, thou shalt not enslave another human being. But you will not find that anywhere in the Bible. The Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, supports slavery. And of course, because the Bible supported slavery, then that encouraged people to practice slavery. They could justify the practice of slavery by saying it's in the Bible. Of course, there were also, on the other side, there were religious people who said that this was wrong, and that was morally wrong, whether it was not in the Bible or not, it was still a moral wrong, and they fought against it. And those were the ones who really went against the Word of God. In other words, to say that slavery is wrong is to go against the Word of God, because that's what it says right there. Genocide is called for in the Old Testament. As you come across a tribe of people that don't believe in your God, that are in your way, kill them. Women, children, animals, everything. Okay? In some cases, you can keep the virgins. The truth. Okay? Religious intolerance. Okay? Any religion, anyone who worships a God that is not Yahweh is worshiping a false God, and therefore you have the right to destroy their temples and shrines. It says so right in the book. And of course, it treats women as property. That's a given. Okay? There is a law in the Bible that says you should not commit adultery. Well, what defines adultery? Adultery is having sex with a married woman. Now, you can have sex with an unmarried woman. That's not adultery unless she's a virgin, and then you have to pay her father a fee for deflowering her and reducing her value. So it's only adultery when you do it with a married woman, because that's a crime against property. Okay? So Bill Clinton did not commit adultery. with Monica Lewinsky. Okay? So anything goes, except for that. 10 Commandments. Now, the 10 Commandments are found in two places. And again, people will tell you, I live by the 10 Commandments. I tried this with my class once. Kid says, I live by the 10 Commandments. All right, everybody get out a piece of paper, write down the 10 Commandments. And they go, uh-oh. So the number ranged from 2 to 10. And 10 were the Orthodox Jewish kids. They knew them all. But all around, it was amazing how people cannot name all 10 Commandments. But it's interesting that in the text itself, you don't find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You find these statements distributed over about 17 lines of text. The 10 Commandments have been taken out of those, extracted them by the 3 religious traditions. So there is a Jewish 10 Commandments, there is a Protestant 10 Commandments, and there is a Catholic 10 Commandments. So the next time someone says, let's put up the 10 Commandments in our public buildings, you say, well, should we do the Jewish one? Should we do the Christian one? Should we do the Protestant one? You're going to offend 2/3 of the people, no matter how hard you try. So they're very interesting. And the most fascinating thing about that, 6 of them are unconstitutional. But they want them put up in our classrooms, in our law courts. But I'll just read them to you. You can see what I mean. I'll do the Protestant ones. You shall have no other gods before me. Violates freedom of religion. Right? You shall not make for yourself a graven image. Violates freedom to practice art, whatever. Right? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. God damn it, nobody worries about that. Certainly not illegal. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There used to be what they call the blue laws. Certain things, stores couldn't be open on Sunday. You couldn't buy liquor until 12 o'clock. All of this stuff was supposed to set aside Sunday. Okay, then came the mall. And that took care of Sunday. Right? So Sunday is football day, followed by shopping, or shopping followed by football. But it's not a sacred day anymore, and you certainly couldn't legalize it. Now here's one. Honor your father and your mother. Now, can you impose that as a law? Some people's fathers and mothers don't deserve to be honored. We know that. Right? But nevertheless, this is a good suggestion, but he certainly does not have the force of law. Okay? And you certainly couldn't enact it. You shall not kill. Okay. That's a good one. Actually, it's you shall not. The actual statement is you shall not murder. We're allowed to kill under lots of circumstances. In war, capital punishment, but murder is a different thing. Okay, so murder means that you're doing it with the intention of not being caught. Okay, but we are encouraged to kill under lots of different circumstances. You shall not commit adultery. Who worries about that anymore? Half of our presidents have committed adultery while in office, and they get away with it. Nobody cares about that. You shall not steal. That's a good one. Okay. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That's a good one too. So what do we got? 3 so far? Okay. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire anything that is not your neighbor's. Where did they start with? Your neighbor's wife. Okay? Don't commit a crime against property. Right? And it says you shall not covet them, and you shall not desire to have anything that is your neighbor's. Well, coveting is the essence of capitalism. If you don't have coveting, people aren't going to buy things. So when you look at the 10 Commandments and say, well, this is the law of the land, our government is based on the 10 Commandments, that's absolute nonsense. And it's kind of fun to whip out the 10 Commandments and say, well, let's go down the list and see how many of these are really legal principles or moral principles that we can live by. So that's the 10 Commandments. It's kind of fun to go through them. Okay. Now, that takes care of the 5 books. And the next 10 books of the Old Testament is really history. It's the history of the 2 kingdoms, Judah and Israel, over a period from about 1200 to the end of the kingdoms, 586 BC. And there's some good stories in there. It starts with the conquest of Canaan. Joshua is supposed to come marching in, destroying cities left and right. The famous story of Jericho, they walk around the walls and they all blast the trumpets and the walls come tumbling down, until the archaeologists went in and discovered that Jericho was destroyed in the year 1400. It was never rebuilt, and when Joshua supposedly came in, there was nothing there. This came to be a big blow to discover that there was no Joshua, there was no Jericho. Right? So over the last, the two kingdoms, Judah and Israel, over a period from about 1200 to the end of the kingdoms, 586 BC. And there's some good stories in there. It starts with the conquest of Canaan. Joshua is supposed to come marching in, destroying cities left and right. The famous story of Jericho, they walk around the walls and they all blast the trumpets and the walls come tumbling down, until the archaeologists went in and discovered that Jericho was destroyed in the year 1400. It was never rebuilt, and when Joshua supposedly came in, there was nothing there. This came to be a big blow to discover that there was no Joshua, or there was no Jericho. Okay? So over the last couple of decades, archaeologists, what is called biblical archaeology, has simply made a lot of discoveries about this period of time, and they found that there was no invasion of Canaan by the Israelites. It was a peaceful settlement of different groups coming into a land which was previously unoccupied. And so there may have been a group of people from Egypt, escapes from Egypt, who set up part of it. There were various people who wandered in and just took over this unoccupied land. And there was a large group of Canaanites, the people who lived there, who migrated up from the cities into this land. So the interesting thing is that the Israelites did not defeat the Canaanites. The Israelites were the Canaanites.